Hey everyone, welcome to a podcast on real criminal law cases through perspective of a teenager in short, easy to understand podcast episodes. My name is Julia and I am an oncoming junior in high school. Just for a bit of background, law has always been something I've been interested in, specifically criminal law. This podcast will not only help me explore my interests further, but my goal is to spark other people's interests for law right alongside me. Once every 2 weeks, I will post a video breaking down and further exploring important criminal law cases and why they were impactful today, all from the perspective of a teenager just trying to learn the ropes of basic criminal law. Now that we've had a proper introduction to this podcast, I'm going to introduce the first case we will be exploring. And today's case is Miranda v. Arizona. And to understand it, you kind of have to forget the TV version of you have the right to remain silent. I know we've all heard that saying, because this real case is about what happens when someone is interrogated by police while completely unaware of what protections and rights they actually have. This begins in Arizona in 1963. At this time, police investigations into serious crimes like kidnapping or sometimes even murder relied heavily on one thing, which was confessions. There were fewer forensic tools than today, obviously, and there were no modern DNA databases like we have now. So, if police wanted to secure a conviction, getting a statement from a suspect was obviously the most powerful piece of evidence that they could have. In this case, police are investigating a kidnapping and assault report involving a young woman. During the investigation, they identify a suspect named Ernesto Miranda and they bring him in for questioning. Now, legally, in the moment Miranda is taken into custody, everything should change. Custody means he is not free to leave, he is under the control of law enforcement now. And this creates what the law later calls a custodial interrogation environment, meaning questioning under police authority where the suspect cannot simply walk away. Miranda is taken into a police station and placed inside an interrogation room. This room is isolated. There are officers present, but no neutral third party, no lawyer, no outside witness, no one whose job is to protect Miranda's interests. At this time in American law, there is no requirement that police inform suspects of their constitutional rights before questioning them. That means there is no formal warning about the right to remain silent, no explanation that statements can be used in court, and no automatic access to counsel during interrogation. So the interrogation begins. Police officers question Miranda directly about the crime. The purpose of the questioning is not casual conversation, it is structured interrogation aimed at obtaining a confession or an admission. Officers control the flow of the information. They present allegations, they challenge responses, and obviously they continue questioning over time. So, in a sense, this is much like a debate. What matters legally is not just what is said, but the environment in which it is said. Miranda is isolated from outside advice, and he is responding to authority figures in a controlled setting where the pressure is entirely one directional. After approximately 2 hours of interrogation, Miranda signs a written confession acknowledging involvement in the crime. That written confession becomes extremely important. In criminal law at that time, a signed confession is one of the strongest forms of evidence available. It is direct, it's explicit, and most importantly, it's highly persuasive to a jury. So at trial, the prosecution relies heavily on this statement as the foundation of its case. Therefore, Miranda is convicted. At this point, the case could have ended like thousands of others at the time, but instead, his lawyers appeal the conviction and they focus on whether or not Miranda committed the crime, but on whether the confession itself should have been allowed in court. This is where the case shifts from a criminal law perspective to a constitutional law perspective. The argument made by Miranda's defense is based on the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution, which protects individuals from being forced to incriminate themselves. In simple terms, you cannot be compelled by the government to provide testimony that directly leads you to your own conviction. The defense argument is not that Miranda was physically forced or like tortured. Instead, the argument is more subtle and much more legally significant. They argue that Miranda's confession was not truly voluntary in a constitutional sense because he was never informed that he held the right to refuse to speak in the first place. So the question now becomes, if someone does not know they have the right to remain silent, can their decision to speak actually be considered an informed choice? This raises a deeper issue in the criminal law procedure. What does voluntary actually mean when someone is in police custody? Because in custody, the environment itself changes human behavior. The Supreme Court later recognizes that custodial interrogation is inherently different from normal conversation. It is structured, controlled, and carried out by authority figures whose role is to gather evidence, not to protect the suspect. So, the legal issue in Miranda is not whether police can ask questions. Police clearly can and must investigate crimes. The issue is whether or not there should be constitutional safeguards before that questioning begins. The case reaches the Supreme Court of the United States, where the justices are not only reviewing Miranda's individual situation, but also examining how police interrogations function literally across the entire country. They look at how custodial integration works in practice. They consider the imbalance of the power between a suspect and law enforcement, and they consider the fact that suspects are often isolated from legal advice. They consider the psychological pressure and created by the prolonged questioning, and consider the reality that most people in custody do not fully understand their legal rights unless they are explicitly told. The court is essentially evaluating whether the system itself creates conditions where self incrimination can happen without full awareness of rights. In 1966, after reviewing Miranda's case, after going over everything that had to do with the interrogation and the individual case, the Supreme Court finally made a ruling in favor of Miranda. But the reasoning is more important than the result, and here is why. The court does not eliminate police interrogation. It does not say confessions are invalid in all cases. Instead, it creates a constitutional requirement designed to protect against uninformed waiver of rights. The court holds that before custodial interrogation, law enforcement must inform suspects of specific rights so that any waiver of those rights is knowingly, intelligent, and voluntary. Something that is very interesting is that this actually becomes the foundation of what many people now know called Miranda rights. Those rights include the right to remain silent, meaning a suspect is not required to answer questions at all. The warning that anything said can be used in court, which establishes the legal consequences of speaking. The right to an attorney during questioning, ensuring legal representation is available at the critical stage of interrogation, and the guarantee that if a person cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided. The key legal principle is that silence or waiver of rights cannot be assumed. It really must be informed. If these warnings are not given, then any statement made during custodial interrogation may be excluded completely from evidence under what is called the exclusionary rule. Now, right about now, I'm sure some people are thinking that, well, because the Supreme Court favored him, that he's probably not guilty. He doesn't have to get convicted, but that is just not true at all. An important legal clarification in this case is what happened to Ernesto Miranda himself after the Supreme Court ruling. This case originally did not declare him innocent. Instead, the court ruled that his original confession was obtained in violation of constitutional protections, meaning it could not be used as evidence. However, Miranda was later retried, and prosecutors used other evidence that was not dependent on the excluded confession, and he was undeniably convicted again. So the case did not change his factual guilt or innocence. It changed the rules that govern police behavior in all other future interrogations in America. The long term impact of this decision is literally enormous. From this point forward, police across the United States are required to give Miranda warnings before custodial interrogation begins. Failure to do so can result in key evidence being thrown out of court. But the deeper significance of this case is not just procedural, it represents a constitutional balance between two competing interests in criminal law: the government's need to investigate crime effectively and the individual's right to be protected from self incrimination under an enormous amount of pressure. The Supreme Court is essentially saying that efficiency in law enforcement cannot come at the cost of informed constitutional rights. And that is what makes this case foundational. It is not about one confession or one defendant. It is about the structure of the interrogation itself and whether the legal systems can rely on statements obtained without explicit awareness of rights. What stands out most when you fully dive in and understand this case is that one of the most familiar phrases in American legal culture, one Americans hear constantly in movies and TV shows, is "you have the right to remain silent." And that only exists because the court recognized a structural problem. People in custody were giving up rights they were never explicitly told they had. That single recognition literally reshaped criminal procedure in the United States permanently. Now, this case is super interesting to me because Miranda v. Arizona isn't just that it created the Miranda warning, it's why the Supreme Court believed those warnings were necessary. Before learning about this case, I always assumed that if someone was innocent, they would simply explain themselves to the police. But this case made me realize that being questioned while in police custody can be incredibly intimidating, and people don't always understand what they have constitutional rights and which rights they do have. The court recognized that someone could accidentally give up those rights simply because they didn't know they had them. I also think it's fascinating that Ernesto Miranda himself wasn't found innocent because of this decision. Instead, the court focused on the fairness of the process. His confession was excluded because it violated the Fifth Amendment, but he was later retried using other evidence and convicted again, which really shows that the case wasn't about helping one individual escape punishment. It was about making sure the justice system follows constitutional rules no matter who the defendant is. Another reason this case stands out to me is how much it changed everyday policing. A single Supreme Court decision permanently changed how police officers across the country conduct interrogations. Today, almost everyone recognizes the words, "you have the right to remain silent," from movies and real life arrests. It's amazing to think that such a common phrase exists because one case decided decades ago. What I find most meaningful is the balance the court was trying to protect. Police need to investigate crimes and keep communities safe, but they also have a responsibility to respect people's constitutional rights. And this case literally just reminds us of that. Overall, I think this case is so memorable because it proves that one Supreme Court decision can influence millions of people and not just the person involved to the original case. It changed criminal procedure permanently and continues to affect every custodial interrogation in the United States today. This case is just overall a great case to start this podcast on. I think we can all agree we learned a lot from this case, and this is such an interesting and exciting case, and it's just one of many of the more to come. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. I think we can all agree we learned a lot from this case, and this is such an interesting and exciting case, and it's just one of many of the more to come. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.